finally, let's talk about concerns over GMOs. Now, if you go onto the internet, one of the biggest things that you'll find that's a concern about genetically modified organisms is something to do with human health. And after 3 decades of selling genetically modified organisms to consumers, there have yet been any evidence of any impact on human health. So, in fact, to this day, all of the genetically modified organisms sold around the world have no impact on human health. Now, this could change in the future because, as I mentioned, we could engineer anything we want into these genetically modified organisms, including toxins or allergens or other things. But for right now, all of the genetically modified organisms that have been produced have no impact on human health. Now, it's definitely possible. There was, in fact, a scientist down in South America that wanted to add a gene from the Brazil nut into soybeans. He knew that the gene he was engineering into soybeans was not the gene that caused the nut allergies from Brazil nuts. But he thought he'd try out whether or not the soybeans were going to initiate or elicit an allergic response, even though he knew that the gene he inserted was not for the nut allergy. In fact, it did lead to allergies and nut allergies in mice for unknown reasons. This was an important lesson because it told scientists that we don't fully understand everything about allergies, and so when we engineer a new organism, a new genetically modified organism, we should always test them for allergies. And in fact, we do. All of the genetically modified organisms that you see here have been tested in animals and in chemical studies to ensure that they don't elicit an allergic response in any person. Interestingly, these types of tests are not done on classically bred crops, and so fatal allergies, such as allergies to kiwi, have formed as a result of classic breeding. So things that people consider natural are actually more harmful and in some cases deadlier than the genetically modified versions, which are tested regularly. Now, as we mentioned, there's no current risk for human health, but there are some risks that scientists are concerned about. And the first one of these is environmental risks. In fact, there was a really important lesson done on understanding genetically modified organisms and their impacts on ecosystems. In particular, this came to light with the understanding and study of the monarch butterfly populations. As you may have read in the news, in the last few years, monarch butterfly populations have been changing dramatically, but generally on a downward trend. There is concern that, in fact, the monarch butterflies may become extinct in the next few decades. Monarch butterflies migrate from Mexico all the way to Canada and back, and in doing so, lay eggs along the way that hatch into caterpillars. The monarch butterfly caterpillars transform into monarch butterflies as well. And it was found, as I mentioned, that their populations are decreasing. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, most notably habitat destruction and loss in Mexico. But there are impacts to monarch butterfly numbers in the United States. And some scientists wondered whether or not that was a result of the genetically modified crops being grown in the US, namely genetically modified corn. Now, of the 2 types of genetically modified corn that are primarily grown in the United States, the BT corn that we talked about earlier and the Roundup Ready corn, the one that scientists thought would impact monarch butterfly populations would be, of course, the BT corn. And that's because Bt corn is a pesticide, so it kills insects. However, when the Bt corn was tested with monarch butterfly populations, it was shown to not impact the monarch butterfly caterpillars at all. Part of this was because when Bt corn was growing, the monarch butterfly populations weren't around to reproduce. In addition, monarch butterfly caterpillars did not live on or reside on the Bt corn leaves or the Bt corn plants. So then scientists were stumped. What else could contribute to the monarch butterfly population declines? They then turned their attention to the Roundup Ready corn that you see here. Here's a field of Roundup Ready corn, and then this is a field of Roundup Ready corn after it's been sprayed by Roundup. As you can see, this is very useful for the farmer because it's a really easy way of killing off weeds. And this is where scientists realized what had happened with the monarch butterfly populations. Monarch butterfly caterpillars only eat one type of plant. They only eat milkweed. They don't eat any other type of plant, including corn, which is why they weren't impacted by the Bt producing corn plants. The milkweed, though, is a weed, and it grows in between a lot of the crops that people grow on their land. So when farmers were growing Roundup Ready corn and then spraying their fields with Roundup, a lot of the weeds, including milkweed, died, killing off the monarch butterfly food when the monarch butterflies were caterpillars. Since all of their young were bereft of food, then they were never able to grow into beautiful monarch butterfly adults. It was the advent and generation of the Roundup Ready version of corn that allowed farmers to spray their fields so much more extensively with Roundup, and as a result, killing a lot of the weeds in their fields, which were really advantageous to the farmers, but disadvantageous to the monarch butterfly. This was an important lesson because it showed scientists that you can't predict what the ecosystem effects would be of genetically modified organisms. That sometimes it takes a lot of research and understanding to understand exactly how widespread the impacts of these plants and changes can be. Another important environmental risk that comes out of genetically modified organisms such as these is the fact that all of these organisms that we're talking about can form what's referred to as extreme monoculture. Monoculture is the term that we use to describe a field of organisms that are all derived from a single species and even a single strain. Mono meaning one and culture meaning varietal or type. One of the things that we've known as biologists and even through human history is that the diversity in ecosystems and diversity of our food supply is extremely important in maintaining stability and security of living systems. We in fact learned this lesson with the Irish potato famine. The Irish potato famine was a result of an infection killing off the one potato strain that all of Ireland was growing as their only food source. Potatoes, in fact, come from South America, where there are over 100 different types. So when that infection ended up killing off one type of potato in South America, the native groups of South America had no problem because they had 99 other types of potato to eat. But in Ireland, they only had one type of potato, and when that one type of potato was wiped out due to disease, there was nothing else for them to eat. There was widespread Irish potato famine, and the Irish ended up emigrating to other parts of the world, including the United States. we're essentially recreating this exact scenario by making these genetically modified crops. Each one of these different types of genetically modified crops came from not only one strain, but in fact one cell in the last couple decades. Essentially, we have fields and fields and fields, acres and acres and acres of clones. And if a single disease were to kill off one of these strains, it would be able to kill off 90% of the soybeans or 90% of the cotton or canola or sugar beets, leaving our food supply devastated. This is why heirloom varieties and biodiversity in our food supply is so important. Now, there are some environmental benefits of genetically modified crops, as we talked about before. With the salmon that grow really quickly, they produce half as much waste and eat half as much food. And that's because they grow twice as fast. So that's an advantage. In addition, the use of the pesticides, the Bt corn, is also advantageous because Bt is a very harmless pesticide. In fact, it's one of the pesticides that organic farmers can use. That's how harmless it is. So instead of using really harsh pesticides that are very dangerous for human health, especially that of farmers, if a farmer uses the genetically modified version, then they can use a fairly harmless pesticide. Likewise, Roundup is a fairly harmless herbicide. Other herbicides are far more harmful and can cause many different health risks. Again, not only to the consumer, but especially to the farmer that applies them to his or her field. So that's it for genetically modified organisms. I hope you learned a lot about the science and also the ethics and the controversies that surround them.